So, let's go. Number 1. Celsus's The True Word. Somewhere around the year 175, a Greek philosopher sat down to write the most dangerous book of his age. His name was Celsus, and we know almost nothing about him. No birthplace, no portrait, no reliable account of his life. What we do know is that he read the Christian scriptures closely, and he did not like what he found. He belonged to the Middle Platonist school, a tradition that prized reason, civic order, and the old gods of Rome. To him, this new sect called Christianity was a threat to all three. His book was titled Alethe's Logos, which translates as the true word, or the true account. The irony sits right there in the title. Celsus claimed to be telling the truth, and for that his book was erased. He argued that Christianity was not ancient at all, but a corrupted offshoot of Judaism with no real pedigree. He mocked the virgin birth, spreading a story that Jesus was the illegitimate son of a Roman soldier named Panthera. He dismissed the resurrection as a tale spread by a hysterical woman. He compared the miracles of Jesus to the cheap sorcery of Egyptian street magicians. Then he made his political charge. Christianity, he said, dissolved the bonds that held the empire together. It pulled people away from civic religion. It recruited the uneducated, the enslaved, and children, and it did its work in secret. This was not just theology to Celsus. It was subversion. Here's the strange part. Every pagan copy of the true word vanished when the Christian empire took control of the libraries. The book should have disappeared completely. It survived only because a Christian scholar named Origen decided to refute it point by point around the year 248, roughly 70 years after Celsus wrote it. Origen's work, called Contra Celsum, or Against Celsus, quoted the original so extensively that scholars believe about 70% of Celsus's text is preserved inside it. In the 20th century, researchers like Otto Glockner and later R. Joseph Hoffman reconstructed the book from these hostile quotations. So why did it vanish so thoroughly? The mainstream view is straightforward suppression. Once the church held power, it destroyed the sharpest attacks on its origins. A second theory points to simple neglect. When paganism collapsed, no one was left to copy pagan manuscripts, and they rotted away. A third, more speculative reading holds that Celsus was uniquely dangerous because he was an early, informed outside witness, and his testimony had to be silenced deliberately. Whatever the cause, the pattern is set. Destroy the book, and it survives only in the mouth of its enemy. If one lone philosopher rattled the church this badly, what happened when a sharper mind wrote 15 volumes? Number 2. Porphyry's Against the Christians. That sharper mind belonged to Porphyry of Tyre. He was a Neoplatonist philosopher, a student of the great Plotinus, and around the year 270, he produced a work that dwarfed Celsus in scale and precision. It reportedly ran to 15 books. It was the most systematic assault on Christianity that the ancient world ever produced. Porphyry did something new. He treated Scripture the way a modern scholar would, hunting for internal contradictions and historical errors. His most famous strike concerned the book of Daniel. The book contains prophecies so accurate that Porphyry concluded they could not be prophecies at all. He argued that Daniel was written in the 2nd century before the Common Era, describing events that had already happened, rather than in the 6th century as tradition claimed. Modern critical scholars reached the same conclusion, but they did so roughly 1,600 years later. Porphyry was ahead of his time by 16 centuries. He kept going. He exposed contradictions between the Gospels. He seized on the open quarrel between the apostles Peter and Paul at Antioch, using it to argue that the founders of the faith could not even agree among themselves. The church could not ignore this. Church fathers, including Eusebius and Apollinaris, wrote multi-volume responses, all of which are now lost. Jerome called Porphyry the most dangerous critic Christianity had ever faced. The response was fire. Around the year 325, after the Council of Nicaea, the Emperor Constantine ordered the work burned. That order alone tells you how threatening it was, but the story does not end there. More than a century later, in the year 448, the emperors Theodosius II and Valentinian III renewed the command, ordering every remaining copy destroyed by fire. That second decree survives in the legal collection known as the Codex Justinianus. Two emperors, 120 years apart, both decided this single book had to be wiped from the earth. They nearly succeeded. Against the Christians survives only as fragments quoted by the very people trying to refute it, men like Eusebius, Jerome, and Augustine. The scholar Adolf von Harnack collected 97 of these fragments in a famous edition published in 1916, though later researchers like T.D. Barnes disputed how many are genuine. Why such extreme measures? The mainstream reading is that Porphyry was seen as a threat to the security of a newly Christian state. A second view emphasizes his method. His textual criticism was simply too accurate, and accuracy was the danger. A third, speculative reading suggests Porphyry had once studied Christianity from the inside, and that an insider's knowledge had to be erased more thoroughly than an outsider's. Pagans attacked from without, but the most ferocious bands, it turns out, were the ones Christians aimed at each other. Number 3. Marcion's Antitheses and the First New Testament. Here's a twist you may not expect. The first person to assemble a Christian Bible was condemned as a heretic, and the church that inherited his idea worked hard to erase him. His name was Marcion of Sinope. He was a wealthy shipowner, and around the year 140 he arrived in Rome with money, influence, and a radical program. Marcion built the first known fixed Christian canon, decades before the Orthodox New Testament was settled. His collection contained just one gospel, a version of Luke, and 10 letters of Paul, a set he called the Apostolicon. He was, as far as we know, the first person to use the word gospel to mean a written book rather than a spoken message. His theological work was called the Antitheses. In it, Marcion drew a sharp line between two gods. There was the wrathful, jealous creator of the Hebrew Bible, whom he called the Demiurge, a lesser being, and there was the loving, previously unknown God revealed by Jesus. Marcion rejected the entire Old Testament as the work of the inferior deity. This was too much for the Roman Church. Around the year 144, it excommunicated him and returned his large donation of 200,000 sesterces. The Church fought back with words. Tertullian wrote 5 entire books, titled Against Marcion, between the years 207 and 212, just to dismantle his teaching. Yet Marcionite churches spread widely and rivaled Orthodox Christianity for centuries, surviving in the East into the 5th century. Not a single copy of the Antitheses or Marcion's Gospel survives. Everything we know is reconstructed from his enemies, chiefly Tertullian and Epiphanius. Adolf von Harnack revived scholarly interest with a book in 1921, and modern researchers like Jason Badun and Dieter Roth have tried to recover his gospel line by line. There is a genuinely unsettling possibility here. Some modern scholars, such as Marcus Vincent, argue that Marcion's gospel may actually predate the canonical Gospel of Luke, which would reverse the traditional order of dependence. The mainstream view treats Marcion as a heretic whose errors were rightly suppressed. A historical reading notes that the Orthodox Church defined its own canon, largely in reaction to his, which means Marcion accidentally shaped the Bible by being the thing it rejected. The speculative reading goes further, suggesting an earlier, simpler gospel was overwritten by the versions we now call canonical. Marcion split God into two. The next, banned authors split the church over a single word. Number 4. The Thalia of Arius. In early 4th century Alexandria, a presbyter named Arius asked a simple question: was the Son of God eternal, or was he created by the Father? Arius answered that the Son was created, that there was a time when he did not exist. That answer would tear the entire Christian world apart. Arius was a clever communicator. He wrote a work called the Thalia, which means the banquet or the festivity. Part of it was composed in popular verse, and Arius reportedly set his ideas to catchy melodies so they could spread among ordinary people, sailors, millers, and travelers, humming theology as they worked. The doctrine caught fire. The response was the most famous church council in history. In the year 325, the Emperor Constantine summoned the First Council of Nicaea to settle the matter. The council condemned Arius and produced the Nicene Creed. The key word in that creed was homoousios, meaning of the same substance, chosen precisely to exclude the Arian position. The whole dispute famously turned on a single letter, the difference between homoousios and homoousios, of the same substance versus of similar substance. This is the origin of the phrase, not one iota of difference. The iota was real. Then came the fire. After Nicaea, Constantine ordered the books of Arius burned, and he made possession of them a capital crime. The edict declared that anyone found hiding an Arian book, rather than burning it, would be put to death. So the Thalia, like the works before it, survives only in fragments, quoted this time by Athanasius of Alexandria, Arius's fiercest opponent, in works written to condemn it. Arius himself was exiled, briefly recalled, and then died suddenly in Constantinople around the year 336. His enemies described his death in grotesque detail, a violent collapse in a public latrine, and framed it as divine judgment. But Arianism did not die with him. It dominated much of the empire under later emperors, and it spread to the Germanic peoples. The Visigoths, the Vandals, and the Ostrogoths were Arian Christians for centuries. Why burn a fellow Christian's books? The mainstream account is the defense of doctrinal purity. A political reading sees Constantine less interested in theology than in unity, using the ban to weld a fractured empire together. A speculative view suggests Arianism may have been closer to a majority position at the time, later rebranded as heresy by the victors who wrote the history. Individual verses and doctrines were being burned, but some rulers set out to erase entire religions. Number 5. Mani's Living Gospel and the Manichaean Scriptures. Most religious founders leave their teachings to be written down by followers. Mani did not make that mistake. Born around the year 216 in Sasanian Persia, near the capital of Ctesiphon, he wrote and illustrated his own scriptures, determined that no one would corrupt his message after he was gone. It did not save them. Mani founded Manichaeism, a religion built on a stark dualism of light against darkness. It became one of the most widespread faiths of late antiquity, stretching from Rome all the way to China along the Silk Road. His canon was remarkable. It included the Living Gospel, the Treasure of Life, the Book of Mysteries, and the Book of Giants. The last of these an adaptation of an older Jewish text about the fallen angels. Mani was also a gifted painter. He produced a picture book, known as the Ardong, that illustrated his cosmology so that even the illiterate could grasp it. And then nearly everything was destroyed. Mani was executed under the Sasanian king Bahram I, around the years 274 to 277, reportedly imprisoned and killed, his body abused. In the year 302, the Roman Emperor Diocletian issued an edict against the Manichaeans, ordering their leaders and their books burned. What makes Manichaeism unique is that it was persecuted by everyone. Christian, Zoroastrian, and later Islamic authorities all systematically destroyed its texts. One of the most famous Christians in history, Augustine of Hippo, spent 9 years as a Manichaean hearer before converting and turning his pen against the faith. For centuries, Manichaean scripture was almost entirely lost, known only through the words of its enemies. Then, archaeology performed a resurrection. Between 1902 and 1914, expeditions to the Turfan Oasis in western China uncovered thousands of Manichaean manuscript fragments, some with exquisite miniature paintings. In 1929, a discovery at Medinet Mahdi in Egypt produced Coptic Manichaean texts, including a work called the Kephaliah. A tiny parchment book, the Cologne Mani Codex, preserved an account of Mani's early life. Why did every civilization it touched try to burn it? The mainstream view is that a rival universal religion threatened whatever faith held local power. A historical reading adds economics, noting the religion's spread along lucrative Silk Road trade routes that rulers wanted to control. A speculative reading suggests Manichaeism was a synthesizing third way, borrowing from Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism, and that its very ability to blend in made it feel like a threat everywhere. Some banned books were entirely real and hunted across continents. But one legendary book was hunted for 400 years before anyone could prove it existed at all. Number 6. De Tribus Impostoribus, the Three Impostors. This is the strangest entry on the list, because for centuries it may have been a book that did not exist. Its title promised the ultimate blasphemy. It argued that the three great prophets, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, were all impostors, frauds who deceived humanity for power. The very idea was so scandalous that its rumored existence terrified the authorities of Europe. The concept surfaced early. In the year 1239, Pope Gregory IX accused the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II of holding the notion that the world had been deceived by three impostors. Some blamed Frederick himself, others his chancellor, Pierre de Vigne. For the next several centuries, scholars and inquisitors hunted for an actual copy of this dreadful book. Rewards were offered, libraries were searched, and no one could find it, which only made the legend grow. Eventually, texts did appear to match the title, though far later than the legend claimed. There was a Latin work, De Tribus Impostoribus, and a French treatise, the Traité des Trois Imposteurs, also known as the Spirit of Spinoza, which began circulating secretly around the year 1700. These texts drew heavily on radical thinkers like Baruch Spinoza and Thomas Hobbes. Printers often gave them false dates and fake places of publication to disguise their true origin, and simply possessing one could bring a charge of atheism. The book's core argument was genuinely dangerous, and not only to the church. It claimed that religion is a political tool, invented and maintained to control the masses. The historian Jonathan Israel has traced how such clandestine writings fed the underground networks of what he calls the radical Enlightenment. So what was it? The traditional theory holds that a genuine medieval text once existed and was lost. The mainstream scholarly view is that the book was pure legend for centuries, a rumor that people eventually wrote real text to fulfill. A third, speculative reading treats the later versions as deliberate forgeries, clandestine works that weaponized an ancient rumor to smuggle in Enlightenment atheism. The Three Impostors shows that a banned book can live as a ghost, feared long before it is real. From an imaginary book, we now turn to a very real bonfire, 24 cartloads of it. Number 7. The Talmud burned at the Disputation of Paris. In the year 1240, in the city of Paris, something unusual happened. A book was put on trial, as if the book itself were a defendant capable of committing heresy. The book was the Talmud, the central text of Rabbinic Judaism, a vast compilation of centuries of legal and ethical debate. The trial, known as the Disputation of Paris, was set in motion by a man named Nicholas Donin. Donin was a Jew who had converted to Christianity, and he denounced the Talmud to Pope Gregory IX, presenting a list of 35 charges. He claimed the book contained blasphemies against Jesus, against Mary, and against Christianity itself. The Pope had already, in the year 1239, ordered copies of the Talmud seized across Europe, though only France, under King Louis IX, fully complied. 4 rabbis were called to defend the text, the most prominent being Rabbi Yechiel of Paris. They argued their case, but the outcome was effectively decided in advance. The Talmud was condemned as heretical and sentenced to destruction. In the year 1242, the sentence was carried out. Roughly 24 cartloads of Jewish books, an estimated 10,000 to 12,000 hand-copied volumes, were burned in the public square, known as the Place de Grève. It is hard to overstate the loss. Each volume had been copied by hand, over months of labor, and was immensely valuable. An entire library of scholarship went up in smoke in a single event. Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, who may have witnessed it, wrote a mournful elegy for the burned books that is still recited in Jewish liturgy. The event marked a dark turning point, a shift from grudgingly tolerating Jewish texts to actively censoring and destroying them. The same pattern repeated at later disputations, at Barcelona in the year 1263, and at Tortosa in the years 1413 and 1414. Why burn a rival faith's entire library? The mainstream explanation is theological offense at passages deemed blasphemous. A historical reading places the burning within the politics of Capetian France, where a pious king could bolster his authority by championing the church against a vulnerable minority. A more speculative view holds that the real threat was intellectual, an independent legal and interpretive tradition operating entirely outside Christian control. And notice the recurring figure, the convert who turns accuser, betraying the tradition he left. Soon, a new machine would arrive that made banning any single author both easier and impossible. The printing press. Number 8. Servetus's Christianismi Restitutio. Some banned books hid more than one dangerous idea. This one concealed a genuine scientific breakthrough inside a theological death sentence. Its author was Michael Servetus, a Spanish physician and theologian born around the year 1509, a true polymath. In the year 1553, Servetus published a work titled Christianismi Restitutio, the restoration of Christianity. Its central argument was an outright rejection of the doctrine of the Trinity, which he considered an unbiblical and illogical construction that obscured the true nature of God. That alone was enough to get a man killed in the 16th century. But buried within the theology was something extraordinary. Servetus included the first European description of pulmonary circulation, the flow of blood from the heart to the lungs and back. He had discovered a fundamental fact of human anatomy, and he tucked it inside a book of forbidden theology, where physicians would not find it for decades. The book was published anonymously and in secret at Vienne, in France. It did not stay secret. Both Catholic and Protestant authorities condemned Servetus as a heretic of the most dangerous kind. He was arrested by the Catholic Inquisition at Vienne, but he escaped from prison. In a fatal miscalculation, he fled to Geneva, the stronghold of the reformer John Calvin. Calvin had corresponded with Servetus years earlier and had warned that if Servetus ever came to Geneva, he would not leave alive. Servetus came. He was arrested, tried, and convicted of heresy. On the 27th of October, in the year 1553, Michael Servetus was burned at the stake at Champel, just outside Geneva. A copy of his book was reportedly strapped to his body as the flames rose. The destruction was nearly total, Of roughly 1,000 copies printed, only 3 survive today, and one of them belonged to Calvin himself and carries his handwritten notes. The killing did not go unchallenged. The scholar Sebastian Castellio attacked Calvin over it, writing that to kill a man is not to defend a doctrine, but simply to kill a man. The case became a landmark in the long argument over religious tolerance and freedom of conscience. As for the science, the near-total destruction of the book delayed recognition of Servetus's discovery. The Englishman William Harvey is credited with describing the full circulation of the blood in the year 1628, apparently unaware that a burned heretic had glimpsed part of it decades before. The mainstream view treats this as a heresy case, plain and simple. A historical reading sets it within the vicious power politics of the Reformation. A speculative reading laments the science suppressed as collateral damage, and the next banned book buried a different forbidden science, a godless universe written in verse. Number 9. Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. Around the year 55, before the Common Era, a Roman poet named Titus Lucretius Carus wrote a poem that nearly carried atomic theory into the grave with him. It was called De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, and it ran to about 7,400 lines of Latin verse. It was not a religious poem. It was almost the opposite. Lucretius set out to explain the philosophy of the Greek thinker Epicurus. The universe, he wrote, is made of tiny, indivisible particles, atoms, moving through an empty void. He proposed that atoms sometimes swerve unpredictably, an idea he called the clinamen, which touched on questions of chance and free will more than 2,000 years before modern physics. He denied that the soul was immortal. He argued that the gods, if they existed at all, took no interest in human affairs and did not punish anyone. His goal was liberation. He wanted to free people from the fear of death and the terror of divine punishment. You can see why this was a problem. A poem denying the afterlife, denying divine judgment, and describing a universe that assembled itself from random collisions was profoundly dangerous to Christian orthodoxy. During the Middle Ages, the work nearly disappeared, surviving in only a tiny handful of manuscripts tucked away in monastery libraries. Its rescue reads like a thriller. In the year 1417, an Italian humanist and manuscript hunter named Poggio Bracciolini discovered a complete copy of the poem in a German monastery. He had it copied, and the ideas began to circulate again. The scholar Stephen Greenblatt told this story in his book The Swerve, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2011, arguing that the rediscovery of Lucretius helped ignite the Renaissance and shape the modern mind. Not everyone welcomed it. A Florentine synod banned the reading of Lucretius in schools around the years 1516 and 1517. But the ideas were loose. Lucretius influenced Montaigne, Machiavelli, Isaac Newton, and Thomas Jefferson, who owned several copies and called himself an Epicurean. The poem even described competition and survival among living things in ways that faintly anticipated Darwin. The oldest surviving manuscripts, known as the Oblongus and the Quadratus, date to the 9th century. The mainstream view attributes the poem's near loss to passive medieval neglect. A revisionist reading sees active theological suppression of its materialism. A speculative reading marvels at how close a foundational scientific idea came to permanent erasure, hanging by the thread of a single rediscovered copy. Lucretius wanted everyone to read the truth for themselves. So did an English priest, and for that wish, they burned his bones. Number 10. Wycliffe's Bible and the Lollard translation. The crime here was almost absurdly simple. John Wycliffe believed that ordinary people should be able to read the Bible in their own language. For that belief, the church declared him a heretic, and, decades after his death, dug up his corpse to burn it. Wycliffe was an English theologian and an Oxford scholar, born around the year 1328. He championed a radical idea that Scripture should be translated from Latin into English so that lay people could read it directly, without the clergy as gatekeepers. Between roughly the years 1382 and 1395, the first complete English Bible was produced by Wycliffe and his followers, translated from the Latin Vulgate. His followers were called Lollards, a mocking term meaning mutterers. Wycliffe did not stop at translation. He attacked the wealth of the Church, the authority of the Pope, and the doctrine of transubstantiation. The Church struck back. In the year 1408, the Constitutions of Oxford banned any unauthorized English translation of the Bible. Owning a Lollard Bible could now bring a charge of heresy, and copies were burned wherever they were found. Wycliffe himself died of a stroke in the year 1384 and was buried in consecrated ground. But his enemies were not finished. In the year 1415, the Council of Constance formally declared him a heretic. Then, in the year 1428, on the orders of the Pope, Wycliffe's body was exhumed, his bones were burned, and his ashes were thrown into the River Swift. It is one of history's most vivid images of an institution trying to erase a man completely. It did not work. Despite the ban, roughly 250 manuscript copies of the Wycliffite Bible survive today, more than any other medieval English text. That survival rate tells you something. People copied it in secret and treasured it, precisely because it was forbidden. Wycliffe's influence spread abroad to Jan Hus in Bohemia, who was himself burned at the stake in the year 1415, partly for spreading Wycliffe's ideas. Wycliffe earned the title the Morning Star of the Reformation, and the Lollards persisted quietly in England until the Protestant Reformation arrived to vindicate them. Why fight so hard against a translation? The mainstream view is doctrinal control. A historical reading sees the clergy defending a monopoly on Scripture that underpinned their power. A speculative reading points to a deeper fear, the prospect of an informed laity that no longer needed the Church to tell it what God had said. Our final banned book is different from all the rest, because it is the one the Church itself eventually admitted it got wrong. Number 11. Galileo's dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. This is the definitive case, the book banned for telling a truth that was refuted by nothing except the sky itself. In the year 1632, in Florence, Galileo Galilei published his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. It compared the old Earth-centered model of the cosmos, inherited from Ptolemy, with the sun-centered model of Copernicus. Galileo made two provocative choices. First, he wrote the book in Italian rather than Latin, which meant that any educated reader, not just scholars, could follow the argument. Second, he framed it as a lively conversation among three characters over 4 days. The character defending the old Earth-centered view was named Simplicio, and many readers, including the Pope, took the name as a deliberate insult. Pope Urban VIII had once been Galileo's supporter, and he felt personally mocked, which poisoned everything that followed. There was history here. Back in the year 1616, the Church had warned Galileo not to hold or defend the Copernican idea, and Copernicus's own book, On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, had been suspended by the Church's index. By publishing the dialogue, Galileo was seen as defying that warning. In the year 1633, he was summoned to Rome and tried by the Roman Inquisition. He was found vehemently suspect of heresy, and he was forced, under threat, to recant his belief that the earth moves. Legend says that as he rose from his knees, he muttered, "And yet it moves, though no one can prove he said it." The dialogue was placed on the index of forbidden books, where it remained until the year 1835, 2 centuries later. Galileo was sentenced to house arrest, which he served at his villa in Arcetri until his death in the year 1642. And yet, remarkably, under house arrest, he wrote what many consider his greatest scientific work, The Two New Sciences, published in the year 1638. The bitter irony is that Galileo was right, and the proof was already visible through his own telescope. He had observed 4 moons orbiting Jupiter, showing that not everything circles the Earth. He had seen the phases of Venus, which only make sense if Venus orbits the Sun. He had tracked sunspots across the face of the Sun. The mainstream reading of his condemnation blames scriptural literalism. A historical reading emphasizes institutional authority and the Church's need to control the interpretation of nature. A speculative reading reduces it to a personal feud between a proud pope and his former friend. In the year 1992, Pope John Paul II formally acknowledged that the Church had erred in condemning Galileo. So what did all 11 of these bands have in common? Look closely, and the same machinery appears again and again. The goal was always to destroy the physical object, the scroll, the codex, the printed volume. Fire was the universal tool, and public burning was a kind of theater, a performance of power meant to be witnessed. The 24 cartloads at the Place de Grève, the pyre at Champel with a book strapped to a man, the ashes of Wycliffe poured into a river. These were not quiet acts. They were spectacles designed to frighten anyone tempted to read. Certain figures recur. There is the convert who becomes an accuser, like Nicholas Donin turning against the Talmud he once studied. There is the insider critic, the one who knows the tradition well enough to wound it, whether Porphyry dissecting scripture or Marcion rewriting the canon. And there is the anonymous author, hiding behind false names, fake dates, and secret presses, as with the 3 impostors, Servetus and Celsus himself. Anonymity and backdating were not cowardice. They were survival tactics. Notice, too, that suppression crossed every boundary. Pagans banned Christians, and Christians banned pagans. Christians banned other Christians over a single letter of a single word. Christian authorities burned the Talmud, and Christian, Zoroastrian, and Islamic powers all destroyed the works of Mani. The impulse to erase a dangerous idea belonged to no single faith. It belonged to power itself. If the machinery of destruction was so relentless, how do we have any of these texts at all? The answer is a set of accidents, and the most common one is beautifully ironic. The single greatest archive of banned literature is the refutation. To argue against a book, you have to quote it, and so the enemy becomes the librarian. Origen preserved Celsus. Athanasius preserved Arius. Tertullian preserved Marcion. Jerome and Eusebius preserved Porphyry. In trying to bury these ideas, their opponents accidentally embalmed them. A second survival mechanism is the desert and the buried cache. The dry sands of the Turfan Oasis and the Egyptian discoveries at Medinet Mahdi returned Manichaean scripture that fire had erased everywhere else. A third is the single lucky manuscript, the one copy overlooked in a remote monastery, like the Lucretius that Poggio Bracciolini pulled off a shelf in the year 1417, or the 3 surviving copies of Servetus out of 1,000. And sometimes sheer volume defeats the censor. Roughly 250 copies of the Wycliffe Bible survive because people simply copied it faster than the authorities could burn it. On top of all this sits modern scholarship. Researchers like Adolf von Harnack, R. Joseph Hoffman, Jason Badun, and Dieter Roth have spent careers reassembling these texts from scattered fragments, piecing a shattered book back together from the quotations of its enemies. Strip away the theology and the politics, and ask what was actually being suppressed in each case. The list is revealing. Sometimes it was rigorous textual criticism, as when Porphyry correctly dated the Book of Daniel centuries before modern scholars confirmed him. Sometimes it was hard scientific fact. Servetus described how blood moves through the lungs. Galileo showed that the Earth orbits the Sun. Lucretius argued that matter is made of atoms in a void. Sometimes the forbidden truth was simply access. Wycliffe wanted people to read scripture in their own language. The Talmud represented an entire independent tradition of law and interpretation operating outside Christian control. Sometimes it was a theological alternative, a different picture of God offered by Marcion, by Arius, by Mani, and in one case, the three impostors. The suppressed claim was the most subversive of all, the argument that revealed religion is a human invention used to manage the masses. What unites them is not that they were all correct. Some of these ideas were wrong, and some remain unprovable. What unites them is that someone in power decided the ideas were too dangerous to be read and judged freely. The ban was never really about falsehood. If these books had been obviously false, refuting them would have been enough. The fire was reserved for the things that might persuade. Here is the most sobering thought of all. Everything we have surveyed survived against the odds. But how much did not? For every Celsus rescued by an Origen who happened to quote him, how many critics vanished completely because no one bothered to write a rebuttal? The books we can name are the lucky ones. The truly successful bans left nothing behind, not even a title, and so we cannot count them. The silence in the historical record is itself a kind of evidence. Even the survivors are contested. Did Athanasius quote Arius fairly, or did he distort him to make the heresy look worse? Did Marcion's gospel really come before Luke, as some scholars now argue, which would upend the traditional story of the New Testament? How many versions of the three impostors were whispered about and then quietly destroyed before the surviving texts were written? These questions may never be fully answered, because the evidence we would need was deliberately turned to ash. The pattern did not end with the printing press, or with the Enlightenment, or with the modern world. Wherever an idea threatens power, the impulse to erase it returns. But there is a strange comfort buried in these 11 stories. A banned book is, in the end, a confession of fear. No one burns a book they consider harmless. The very effort to destroy a text is a measure of how dangerous its truth was thought to be. Every one of these bonfires was an admission that the words might win. And in almost every case, given enough time, they did.